Hey everybody. So sometimes when I hear people talk about philosophy, they're generally critical because they think that all philosophers do is argue over definitions. And I'm pretty sure Neil deGrasse Tyson has voiced this concern as well. So I wanted to give my thoughts about it, okay? And I have a couple of thoughts. So the first thought is that it's true that philosophers debate over definitions a lot. And the reason for that is because we're trying to understand the essence of a thing, right? We're trying to understand the nature of a thing. So let's take cultural appropriation as an example. Let's say you're having a discussion about this and somebody says, I think when this happens, it's cultural appropriation and it's therefore wrong, right? Let's say that that's what their argument is. Okay, so if you're going to have a philosophical debate over that, the first question that you want to answer is, what does cultural appropriation mean, right? How do we define it, right? What are the essential properties of it? What are the, quote unquote, necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for something to count as cultural appropriation? So I understand that concern, okay? But I don't see this as a downside. Like, I actually think that this is important. If you actually believe that cultural appropriation is wrong, you're gonna have to give me an idea, a definition of what you mean by cultural appropriation, okay? And then we can, disagree over how reasonable that definition is, right? I recently had a conversation with one of my friends about cultural appropriation, and, we were trying to figure out exactly what it meant, and like what the most plausible definition of it was, right? So one question was, whether or not we think that there has to be a financial component. Does one person have to make money, right, for it to count as cultural appropriation, right? The other thing that we talked about is, whether or not it's done respectfully and whether or not it has to be done disrespectfully, So these were the important components that we were trying to figure out. Because if you want to say, right, that let's say, white people selling Asian food or something like that, right? Like, does this count as cultural appropriation? It's like, okay, well, I don't know. Like, does it fit the definition that we've come up with? The other thing that I want to clarify is that it's not just about coming up with proper definitions, though that is important, okay? Because you want to be able to answer particular questions, and depending on the question, you need to first have a definition and then continue on the discussion to answer the question. Let's say if the question was whether or not this particular act counts as cultural appropriation, well, then what you need to do is come up with a definition of cultural appropriation, okay? But if the question is whether or not this act is wrong because it's cultural appropriation, well, then you have to continue the discussion, right? You first have to come up with a definition of cultural appropriation, and then you have to continue the discussion. It's like, now that we've come up with, what we consider to be the most plausible conception of cultural appropriation, do we consider it to be wrong? That's going to be the other question that you have to answer. So the entire discussion is not going to be just about defining terms. The other thing to keep in mind is that you don't necessarily have to come up with the best definition of a particular term in order to have a discussion about it. So, what I do sometimes is that, let's say I'm having a discussion with another person and maybe we don't even agree on what the conception is, right? Because maybe I just don't really have an idea. I don't have a personal opinion. We can have a discussion of, over a hypothetical, right? So the structure of the discussion would be, if what you're saying is true, then does it follow that, this particular act is cultural appropriation and is therefore wrong? And the reason why I do that is because it's useful, right? It's dialectically useful, right? Because sometimes I really don't, or one person doesn't really have an opinion about like what the best definition of something is. And you don't want to spend the entire time arguing over and trying to figure out what the best definition of something is. So you just kind of operate with some sort of hypothetical. Often when I have philosophical conversations, after the definitions part, it usually turns into like this counterexample exercise, right? Like, people are trying to come up with a counterexample to your particular position. So if your position is that, this particular act is cultural appropriation and is therefore wrong, what I'm probably going to try to do is come up with counterexamples. Like, okay, what do you think about this case, right? What do you think about if this person does this? To me, that doesn't seem wrong. What do you think? Right? And the goal is to see if that person's position is consistent with their other pre-existing beliefs, right? If they're internally inconsistent, well, then that's a problem, right? And then they have to either refine their definition or they have to change their intuitions. All right, I'm going to end it here. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you all next time.